Section 12 of Nature and Art, Volume 8, Number 1, June 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Miscellany. Homing Pigeon. Sleep, little pigeon, and fold your wings, little blue pigeon with velvet eyes. Sleep to the singing of mother bird swinging the nest where her little one lies. In through the window a moonbeam comes, little gold moonbeam with misty wings. All silently creeping, it asks, is he sleeping? Sleeping and dreaming while mother sings? But sleep, little pigeon, and fold your wings, little blue pigeon with mournful eyes. Am I not singing? See, I am swinging the nest where my darling lies. Eugene Field. One day a carrier pigeon tapped at the window of Mrs. Nansen's home at Christiania. Instantly the window was open, and the wife of the great Arctic explorer in another moment covered the little messenger with kisses and caresses. The carrier pigeon had been away from the cottage 30 long months, but had not forgotten the way home. It brought a note from Nansen, stating that all was going well with his expedition in the polar regions. Nansen had fastened a message to the bird and turned it loose. The frail courier darted out into the Arctic air, flew like an arrow over perhaps 1,000 miles of frozen waste, and then over another 1,000 miles of ocean and plain and forest, to enter the window of its waiting mistress and deliver the message which she had been awaiting so anxiously. We boast of human sagacity and endurance, but this loving carrier pigeon, after an absence of 30 months, accomplished a feat so wonderful that we can only give ourselves up to wonder and admiration. Utilization of the homing instinct of the domesticated varieties of the blue rock pigeon, the Columba livia, by employing the birds as messengers for physicians living at some distance from their patients, is comparatively new, and is the latest evidence of the value of these birds. A few doctors have made the experiment, and it only remains to prove the facility with which the pigeons can be employed in order to determine whether they are likely to come into general use for this purpose. The importance of establishing pigeon service for busy, overworked country doctors is strongly urged in favor of the plan, and it is agreed that there is no other such efficient or speedy means of carrying messages. The carrier dove, which is the emblem of peace, though used in these times for carrying war messages, obeys the one governing impulse of its small heart, when, released at a distance from its mate and its nest, it turns with marvelous fidelity to its home cote. With no compass except that home-seeking instinct, no reliance except in the exquisitely adjusted beat of its wings, it soars upward until its keen eyesight and quick perceptions give certainty of direction. Then, at a splendid pace of 1,400 yards in a minute, it speeds on its journey home. Mated birds the best. Once a male bird has regularly mated, he will fly back to his duties as a husband and father as fast as he can. These duties are serious and practical, for the male bird bears his full share in sitting upon the eggs and in feeding the nestlings when hatched, for which purpose both cock and hen possess special faculties and functions. The homing tendency acts best when it is entirely concentrated. For example, it has been found that a mated pair will not fly home together with anything like proper certainty. They stop and dally by the way. They behave like holiday people who have got somebody to mind the babies. In order to have trustworthy messengers for war or peace, the pigeons must not be bachelors, nor loafers, nor be flown with associates. They must be the respectable mated birds with establishments, so that in employing them for war messengers one actually presses domestic virtue. They must be the respectable mated birds with establishments, so that in employing them for war messengers one actually presses domestic virtue, as well as love and parental instinct, into the service of the military. But even the peaceful pigeon can be sometimes pugnacious on his own account, and a jealous fantail, or tumbler, or Antwerp, or Jacobin often will conduct himself like a gamecock, though painters and poets from time immemorial have agreed to regard this bird as the natural emblem of gentleness and peace. It is the accepted token of the Holy Spirit, which descended in the form of a dove. All literatures are full of this thought. Pigeons in legend and story. The Arabs have a story that when an angel of Allah offered to King Solomon the water of immortality in a ruby cup, it was a dove that dissuaded him from drinking it, and thereby from living mournfully to survive those whom he loved in an earth grown desolate and lonely. And it was because of the maternal courage of a dove, which had followed its captive nestlings all the way to the Prophet's house, that Mohammed instituted that merciful decree, which still prevails all over the East, and which forbids true believers to touch or even to taste of the flesh of any creature which has not been halalled, that is to say, over which, while alive, the prayer of pardonable bloodshed has not been uttered. The birds, gentle and stainless, which Sappho sang of, harnessed to the golden chariot of the splendor-throned queen, Immortal Aphrodite, in some cases have been converted into messengers of death and ruin. Some hold that this is better than to see them immolated for prizes by unsportsmanlike gunners at Monte Carlo and such places, for the birds remain unaware of their new duties, and carry messages from a beleaguered fortress, or the call for aid from a sinking warship, or the state of a suffering patient, alike carelessly and ignorantly, as if the missives tied to their feet were perfumed messages sent by lovers. Used by physicians. In the early 90s, Dr. S. Weir Mitchell of Philadelphia used pigeons in the case of a patient ill of nerve fatigue several miles from his house, thus accomplishing two purposes, a daily report and the salutary effect of leading the worn mind of the patient into a new channel. Dr. Philip Arnold, in a recent medical journal, tells of receiving messages from his patients in the country every day, in addition to his daily visits to them. His plan usually is to leave a pigeon the day he makes a visit, and direct that the pigeon be liberated the next day with such a message as he requires. With a little care in the instruction of the nurse, he is informed of the condition of the patient before he starts to make his next visit. In a country practice this is important, since it enables the physician to judge what will be needed for his patient in the next 24 hours, and the country physician usually is his own druggist. Country doctors cannot often make more than one call on a patient in 24 hours, and by an aerial messenger service they can get practically the same information as the doctors in the city or hospital practice by leaving two pigeons and getting morning and evening reports. The country doctor often is called from one patient to other persons sick in the neighborhood. This will make him late in getting back, and it is a great convenience if he can send this information home, practically with the same speed as the city practitioner through the medium of the telephone service. Tells what kind to use. Dr. Arnold suggests that physicians wishing to take this matter up in earnest first of all should purchase only the best of Belgian homing pigeons, 1 or 2 pairs well mated. No reliance can be placed on young birds newly purchased for message carriers. Young birds, to be of service, must have been hatched in the home loft. The old birds secured for breeding must not be given their liberty until they have hatched 1 or 2 broods. The youngsters at a certain age can be trained. A young pigeon begins his racing life when he is 10 weeks old, with graduated journeys varying from 2 to 50 and 70 miles in length. At the age of 6 months he is usually fed on a diet of beans and maple peas for a few months of hard racing work, the season commencing in April. The length of the races varies from 50 or 100 to as much as 600 miles. There is not competition between rival fanciers and great excitement about the results. Winter is the pigeon's time of retirement. He is not compelled to race, for racing is only profitable when wind is fair and the air is absolutely clear. Whatever the wonderful power that guides the pigeon home over hundreds of miles of unknown country, it is certain that sight plays an important part, for the least sign of haziness in the air will put the pigeon in the position of a derelict ship. A bird of good quality costs from $5 to $20 when 1 month old, and a practiced racer 1 year old generally brings from $25 to $100. When using these birds for messenger service, the message is written upon the thinnest rice paper, rolled up, and deposited in an aluminum holder, which is fastened to the bird's leg. This holder is in the shape of a capsule, with a small band, which is easily attached to the leg of the bird. Professor Marion of the Naval Academy at Annapolis invented the holder, which is watertight when the lid is on and weighs but 8 grains. One of the most remarkable incidents illustrating the wonderful memory of a homing pigeon was that of a bird made a prisoner during the Franco-Prussian War. This pigeon, after being in captivity for 10 years, immediately returned to its home after being liberated from confinement in a foreign country. The hardships which these birds will unflinchingly face in returning home can hardly be appreciated by those who are not familiar with them. Birds so badly shot or torn by hawks as to be rendered almost helpless, notwithstanding their injuries, will struggle onward until at last their home is reached. From extreme distances, such as points beyond 500 miles, the birds are at a great disadvantage, inasmuch as they are thereby forced to forage for themselves, something they are not trained to do. As a result, they are unreliable and slow when called upon for such work. There are birds which have homed 614 miles air line the day after, and there are few pigeons in this country that have covered more than 1,000 miles air line, the extreme distance covered being 1,212 miles. It seems really impossible to extinguish the homing instinct in a good pigeon. A story is told of a French carrier pigeon which was captured by the German soldiers during the siege of Paris in 1870. The bird was being carried in a balloon from Paris to some point in the country, whence it was expected to return to Paris with a message. It was taken to the German headquarters and presented to the commander, Prince Frederick Charles, who sent it to his mother in Germany. Here it was placed in a splendid roomy aviary and carefully fed and nourished. But although it was kept here, living in the lap of royal luxury for 4 years, the French pigeon did not forget its fatherland. At the end of that time the aviary was left open one day. The pigeon flew out, mounted high in the air, flew about for a moment as if to find the points of the compass, and started in a straight line for Paris. 10 days afterward it beat its wings against the entrance to its old loft in the Boulevard de Clichy. There it was recognized, and its case being brought to public attention, it was honored as a patriot returned from foreign captivity. It remained at the Paris Jardin d'Acclimatation until it died in 1878. In Belgium, where pigeon racing is as great sport as horse racing is in England and America, the birds have made a speed of 70 miles an hour for short distances. From 30 to 40 miles an hour is, however, the average speed of the average bird. Though not by nature strong of wing or equipped for long flight, the birds have been known to cover great distances. Probably the longest journey of which there is any record was made some 10 years ago. A family of birds had been taken from Belgium to New York, where they were to be bred and trained. They were released from the cote before they had been thoroughly domesticated, and straightway disappeared. 2 weeks later 3 of the pigeons, bedraggled, weary, and nearly dead, arrived at their native cote in Belgium. How they made the long ocean voyage nobody ever knew, but they had evidently accomplished it in some manner, and out of respect for their wonderful achievement, they were allowed to remain in the home to regain which they had suffered so much. The San Francisco Examiner records that Sadie Jones, C. 21,392, is the champion long-distance homing pigeon of America and the world so far as is known. She flew from Lake Charles, Louisiana, to Philadelphia, a distance of 1,202 12-100 miles in 16 days and 3 hours. Sadie Jones is the property of M.S. Sullivan, of West Philadelphia, and was 5 years of age at the time of making the record. She was named after the daughter of the National Race Secretary, Charles H. Jones, and was personally countermarked and shipped by that young lady, together with 5 others. She was the only one to return. So far as known, no other pigeon has ever flown this distance. When the writer was many years younger, to please the rising generation, he made a dovecote and procured a few tame pigeons. In the course of time the birds had increased by not only rearing young, but by inducing strange birds to accept the quarters offered. The pigeons were regularly fed, the meal hour being announced by a peculiar whistle. The dinner call was soon known to all the birds in the place, and the yard would immediately fill with birds from every direction, when the whistle was blown. On one occasion a lame bird in the flock, which had evidently been caught in a snare and escaped with a slip noose on one leg that had cut into the flesh, making the poor bird very lame, came with the rest. After considerable pains the bird was caught, the string cut, and the bird placed on the ground. It stood a moment as if amazed, and then flew up to its liberator's knee and fed out of his hand. End of section 12.
Section 13 of Nature and Art, Volume 8, Number 1, June 1900. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Sawasawaya. The Two-Storied Nest by Ethel Morton. Looking from my study window one day last June, I noticed a little yellow and brown bird who was hopping from bush to bush. She was busily chattering to another bird who sat on a neighboring tree, evidently much enjoying a worm he was eating. I knew the pair directly as my friends of the season before, the yellow warblers. Mrs. Warbler was looking for a good place to build her nest. After some consideration, she decided on a bush in front of my window. Off she flew to a field of dandelions, and soon returned with several pieces of dandelion fluff. It took quite a while to complete the house, for Mrs. W. was very neat and precise in her work. But after it was finished, Mr. Warbler came over to look at it. He had left the building to his wife, and as he seemed perfectly satisfied with it, Mrs. Warbler was happy. Not many days after this, some pretty little blue eggs lay snugly in the nest, and Mrs. Warbler was a mother. Alas! On the day the young warblers left their shells, their mother came home from a call on Mrs. Robin to find her children crying most bitterly. An ugly cowbird had dropped its great brown spotted egg right in their beautiful parlor. It seems to be a custom with these birds to leave their eggs in the nests of their unfortunate neighbors rather than hatch them themselves. Poor little Mrs. Warbler! She tried with all her strength to push the egg out of her home, but without success. So what do you suppose she did? Why, she just built another nest on top of the old one. It was a great deal of trouble, and the young warblers tried her patience sorely by persisting in pulling at the threads and straws as she wove the framework of her new dwelling. Labor is its own reward, however, for there was not a happier couple in all birdland than Mr. and Mrs. Yellow Warbler when they brought their admiring friends and relations to see the young warblers in the two-storied nest. End of section 13. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 14 of Nature and Art, Volume 8, Number 1, June 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Industry, Wheat Harvesting. J. F. Stewart, Chapter 1. We have been told ye cannot live by bread alone, which is, no doubt, true. But aside from the use of animal flesh as food, bread in some form has played the greatest part in sustaining mankind. There have been found on every continent and every island of the globe rude stone implements that tell, by form only, of their possible use. We read the story of the prehistoric relics largely by comparison with modern things, and hence judge that the crescent-shaped flint implements, serrated upon their inner edge, to be seen in the British Museum and elsewhere, may have been used by the savages as reaping hooks. The natural habitat of wheat must necessarily remain a matter of dispute, for history cannot tell us of the time when the wild grain began to be cultivated by the savages, whose traditions are silent, nor when it was introduced into the various countries. The first harvest scenes depicted are found upon the stones of ancient Egypt, representing slaves with reaping hooks at their tasks, scenes cut there before the time of Moses, long before the Exodus. In the ruins of Egypt bronze reaping hooks have been found, differing little from those used for trimming long hooks. In the sediment of Lake Neuchatel, in Switzerland, where have been discovered the remains of an ancient and forgotten people, whom we name merely the lake dwellers, wheat and other grains have been found, and also reaping hooks of bronze; and from the bogs of the Scandinavian countries, where, in conformity with religious rites, were thrown prized articles upon the death of their owners, sickles have been taken. From the time of bronze in Egypt to the centuries following the Dark Ages, the reaping hook was probably the only instrument used in the harvest. When comes the beginning of the end of barbarism in a nation, then industrial progress germinates, and in proportion as barbarism has decreased, the efforts for improvements in methods adapted to reduce human labor have been successful. The cloud that cast its shadow over Europe during the so-called Dark Ages practically suppressed all efforts, and it is only since then that the energies directed to mechanical progress have had a fair field. Following the reaping hook, not many centuries ago, came the scythe for moving hay. It was but an enlarged reaping hook, so planned as to call into action the entire physical system, however, instead of the mere right arm, and with it a man was able to lay in swath many times more grass than had been accomplished by any previous implement. In America, at the beginning of this century, the scythe has been modified so as to adapt it to the cutting of grain, and with it the straw was laid in a neat swath by a man who swung it, ready to be raked and bound by another. This, however, was nothing more than an implement. We read that machines were attempted before the beginning of the present century, and are told by Pliny and others of a box-like cart pushed by an ox between rearwardly extending thills, and having a comb at front, adapted to pull the heads from the standing grain. A man walking beside with a hoe-like instrument scraped the heads into the box. It is no marvel that this implement, made by the Gauls as early as A.D. 1, did not come into general use. We also read that a machine was attempted in Hungary during the latter part of the 18th century, and that prizes were offered in England for a reaping machine. It is safe for us to consider, however, the efforts of Mr. Gladstone of England, who in 1806 produced a machine adapted to cut grain and deliver it in a swath beside the machine. With what success we are mainly left to judge by the construction of the machine itself, which embodied many of the valuable elements of the reaping machine that held sway during the second third of the present century, only to be forced into the background by better harvesting methods. In order to give Mr. Gladstone the credit due him, it is proper to say that his reaper, like 9/10 of the modern harvesting machines, was adapted to be drawn, and not pushed, as the implement of the Gauls was. Its cutting apparatus was extended well to the right, so that the horse drawing it might walk beside the grain to be cut. It was supported upon wheels, one at the outer extremity of the cutting apparatus, and the other substantially in the position now placed in harvesting machines, and his cutting devices were operated by it. His machine was not only adapted to cut the grain, but deliver it at one side in order to make a clear path of travel in cutting the next round. His machine did not come into use, but was patented and thus made public. Whether practical in detail or not matters little, for he left to the world as a legacy the foundation principles of the reaping machine. Those who followed enriched the art only by additions and modifications. A second patent was granted to him, covering improvements. His machine might leave the grain in almost a continuous swath or in gavels, which depended only upon the number of raking devices applied to his rotary cutting apparatus. In the patent granted to Salmon, who followed him in 1808, is found a grain receiving platform, differing in no respect from that of the early practical reaper, a cutting apparatus placed at its forward edge, a divider to separate the grain being cut from that left standing, and an orbitally moving rake adapted to remove the grain in gavels to the ground. While it is of actual achievements that we shall mainly write, it is well to say that the actual achievement of the reaping machine was accomplished largely from knowledge given us by those early inventors, and it is proper that we point out precisely what they have taught us, for more than 30 machines have been patented in England and America before the machine of Bell, the Scotch preacher, of 1828 was placed upon the market in England. Kerr, Smith, and others added their mite of knowledge, and in 1822 Henry Ogle, an English schoolmaster, invented a reaping machine that was made by a Mr. Brown, and which cut 1 acre per hour. The trial was so successful that the laborers in the field, fearing the competition of the innovation, mobbed the inventor and maker and broke up the machine. The patent shows its construction. The cutting apparatus of modern harvesting machines is a modified form of shears. In the early machines, shears, pure and simple, were arranged in series before the receiving platform. As cutting devices they operated well, but were objectionable on account of the fact that they did not clear themselves of shreds of straw and grass. Bell's machine may be considered the first practical reaper, because in it was found the essential combination of mechanical elements, not only of the reaping machine, but largely of the modern self-binding harvester. His machines were so successful that as late as 1864 they were busy in the harvest fields of England, and laid a swath more perfect than any implement used before them. They were followed by a troop of girls, the like of which is still seen in the fields of those sections of England and Scotland where the modern self-binding harvester has not yet found its way. The erstwhile Scotch student, when working behind closed doors on the little farm worked by his father, though inspired by high hopes, little dreamed that he was in any measure laying the foundation for greater results, and a few, at the present day, know that one of the most essential elements of the modern self-binding harvester was reduced to practice by that youth who, as the Rev. Patrick Bell, administered to the spiritual wants of the members of a little flock in Scotland for many years. 2 machines at least were brought to America, but not until American reapers had been perfected to such an extent as to meet all of the requirements. Bell's machine was pushed before the horses, as modern headers are. Its reel was supported by forwardly reaching arms as now. It had dividers and all essential elements, the only faulty one being the cutting apparatus. The story of his efforts, as told by himself, is interesting. The facts pertaining to the construction of his machine may be found in encyclopedias and in court proceedings. Although America is considered the cradle of this art, we must bow to Bell and others, and claim only that which we have accomplished, founded upon the information and machines they left. In the fishing village of Nantucket, on the island of that name, of Quaker parents, a boy first saw light who later became famous because of his inventive talent. In that little village the whaling industry, upon which success in life depended, was extensively carried on. Like other boys, the lad Obed Hussey took to the sea, but tiring, turned his attention to a machine for reaping grain. He made a model of the machine, and in 1832 constructed a machine which he operated in the harvest fields near Cincinnati, Ohio. He builded better than he knew, for his cutting apparatus sings his praise in the harvest fields of every continent, and will probably do so until man ceases to exist. It has been modified in various ways, but no material improvement has been made since it left his hands. His machine was a combined reaper and mower. He placed his gearing carriage upon two wheels. Not a mowing machine of the present day is constructed otherwise. He jointed his cutting apparatus to the supporting frame in order that the machine might conform to irregularities of the surface of the ground. Again, it may be said not a mowing machine of today is constructed otherwise. In order to adapt his machine to cutting grain, a detachable grain receiving platform was applied, and a stand for a raker as well. As manual delivery reapers, thousands of such machines are made in America and sent to Europe, where the self-binding harvester has not yet won its way. These four things were new: his cutting device, his raker's stand, the cutting apparatus jointed to the gearing carriage, and the detachable grain receiving platform. Limiting our inquiry to hand-raking reapers, it is proper to say that this was the culmination. No reaper has ever been made since that time that did not have these elements arranged as he had combined them. In the face of historical facts, court decisions, and patent office records, printer's ink will be wasted in vain in any attempts to win the laurels from the modest Quaker. The necessities that called for these machines were the result of the high hopes of the pioneers of the West, who, finding natural garden spots of dimensions greater than the scope of the eye, plowed and sowed more than they could reap. More than labor could there be found to reap. Naturally, then, the first practical machines of America were invented where the great Western fields which in their ripeness inspired inventors. On a day during the harvest of 1833, a group of farmers and idlers were interested in the tests of a reaper about to be made. Mr. Hussey's machine was started, but some disarrangement caused delay. An incredulous young man, strong of arm, picked up the implement of one of the cradlers and swung it with a broad sweep into the grain, declaring that that was a kind of reaper to have. Mr. Hussey, though possessed of a quiet manner characteristic of the Quaker, felt stung, and asked the bystanders to help him uphill with his machine. He then guided the machine down it on the run, and every straw was laid upon the receiving platform with the exactness in which it grew. The machine repaired demonstrated its ability to such an extent that others were ordered for the following harvest, and manufactured in a little shop on the farm of Judge Algernon Foster, near Cincinnati, Ohio. For the harvest of 1834, 2 machines were made and sold, and from that time on have continued to be used up to the present day, where, as said in the so-called manual delivery reapers, extensively used in Europe, they are found, substantially as constructed by him, having added thereto only the finishing touches applied by modern mechanics. As a mowing machine, slight improvements have been made. The only competitor for several years was one produced by Enoch Ambler, patented in 1834. A single supporting and driving wheel was used in Ambler's, and a reciprocating cutting apparatus also, but the specific construction was not like that of Mr. Hussey. It came into considerable use, and may be considered the prototype of the single wheel reaping and mowing machines that found their way upon the market subsequent to 1840. With the practical features proposed by a third of 100 inventors, carefully embodied in the machines at the close of the first third of the century, came the practical reaping and mowing machine. Nearly one half of the labor of the harvest field was dispensed with. The ring of the cradle blade, when whetting after the cutting of every round, soon ceased to be heard. The sound of the cutting device of the reaper and mower was not so musical, but may be likened to the chuckle of one in his ecstasy who has succeeded in his accomplishment. The burning sun scorched but half as many laborers as before. The labor of weary ones over the hot stove in the crude habitations on the farms was lessened. The harvest time became less dreaded, the scarcity of help became less felt, and the hours of labor were shortened. Homes became more cheerful, for the farmers' wives and daughters, before called from household duties into the burning sun, had now moments that could be devoted to planting the rows and vines. Reflecting upon those early days, experiences such as can soon only be called by the artist are brought to mind. In our imagination we see the troop of harvest hands, arisen from an early breakfast, taken after an hour's labor at chores, moving to the fields often before the sun has kissed the dew from the lilies that beckon them on the way. Young women as well as young men, though with a hard day's labor before them, they are chatting merrily as when gathering at school in the winter, when the labors on the farm are not so great. In those days few children who could walk knew leisure. The babe was often taken to the field, and a still toddling youngster left in charge while the mother bound after the cradlers. It seems as if the expression "hungry as a hired man" must have originated on these western prairies, for in these early days 5 meals a day was the rule. About mid-forenoon 2 boys were spared from the field long enough to go for luncheon, soon to return with a well-filled basket and water jugs. The cloth was spread upon the stubble, and a hasty but hearty meal spread. Perhaps a solitary tree shaded them. So far the harvest scene resembled the picnics we enjoy today. In the heat of the day an hour was taken for rest. At mid-afternoon another lunch was served. Then at sunset came the supper, only after which, from early morn, the kitchen stove was permitted to lose its blush, and the milking time, far into the starlight, while the night hawk boomed, and the rest for the day came after Bob White and the whippoorwill had ceased their calls. What a change this century has wrought! One man now accomplishes as much as 16 did in the early days. The self-binding harvester of today, through the reaping machine, was of a growth so slow that the efforts of a third of a century were required before the reaper was driven to the hillsides. But of this later. End of section 14.
Section 15 of Nature and Art, Volume 8, Number 1, June 1900. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Tavarish. A Charming Home. Anna R. Henderson. Wodie and I in the strawberry bed, searching for strawberries juicy and red, breathing the airs of a morning in spring, listening the notes that the meadow larks sing. Heartbeats and pulse beats keeping in tune with all that is lovely in beautiful June. Sharp little tweeters near by us we heard. Where was the haunt of the dear little bird? Soon the wee nest and its nestlings we found, safe in a catnip bush close to the ground. Home of the sparrow whose chirruping brood kept their 4 yellow mouths open for food, by their fond mother unceasingly fed with morsels of strawberry, fragrant and red. "Oh, mamma," said Wodie, "did ever you see so tiny a nest in so tiny a tree? And isn't it perfectly lovely to stay in the spicy catnip leaves all day, and whenever you wish for something to eat, to dine on a slice of strawberry sweet? To hear the father bird singing a tune in the old peach tree all the afternoon? And to be shut out from the dew at night by the touch of mother wings soft and light? I think when these dear little birdies stray from their home in the catnip bush away, wherever their dear little forms may go, in the summer's sun or the winter's snow, they will say, as the old folks always do, that the baby days were the best they knew. End of section 15. This recording is in the public domain. End of Nature and Art, Volume 8, Number 1, June 1900.